You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome to this week's episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sarah Backer. The month of May is American Wetlands Month, a time to celebrate the critical importance of wetlands and the benefits they provide to people and wildlife. Wetlands provide flood protection, resilient infrastructure, carbon storage, increased water quality, and are integral to the culture and economy of local communities. Since 1989, ELI has emphasized the importance of wetlands through our National Wetlands Awards program. The program's core mission is to call attention to the value of wetlands and celebrate the important work being done by individuals to protect these vital ecosystems. Over the years, we have given awards to 225 individuals, communities, and agencies. Joining me to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the National Wetlands Awards this year, or the NWAs as we like to call them, is ELI's research associate, Isabella Blanco. Welcome, Bella.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah.
I know that for this year's awards, we are doing something a little bit different. Can you tell us a bit about this year's National Wetlands Awards?
So this year marks the 35th anniversary of the National Wetlands Awards, as you know, and in lieu of a ceremony that we usually host every year, we are celebrating this milestone by highlighting the amazing work of our past awardees. Throughout the month, we will be bringing you stories from different awardees via our podcast, blog, and various social media platforms. Specifically on the podcast, we will be sitting down with different awardees and highlighting their stories and what this award has meant to them.
Thanks, Bella. So, who is our first award winner?
So first off, we are sitting down with our 2013 NWA awardee, Tom Rees. Tom Rees is the president and founder of the Ecosphere Restoration Institute, a nonprofit that facilitates and leverages matched dollars for restoration. Through his nonprofit, Tom has donated thousands of hours of his time toward habitat restoration. Tom is a nationally known ecologist with more than 37 years of experience in restoring natural systems in Florida. His work has resulted in the restoration of more than 2,400 acres of wetlands.
Thanks, Bella. Let's turn it over to you and Tom.
Tom, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Tom, you were recognized by the National Wetlands Award in 2013 for your contributions to wetland conservation and restoration. How did you get your start in the wetlands world?
When I was a kid, I used to watch Jacques Cousteau, and I was enamored with that. So I knew I was going to be in the field of biology. I got a degree at the University of South Florida in biology and geology. When I came out in '83, there were no jobs. So I just became a lab tech doing research for 3 years, but kept an eye out. And finally, there was a job opening, and it was to map the nation's wetlands through the National Wetlands Inventory. So I was very glad to get that job. I learned a lot mapping and identifying wetland plants from remote sensing and in field work. That's how this all started. And then I've had a very fortunate start in my life. Was after that, there was a brand new program started by the state called SWIM, or Surface Water Improvement Management. And my job is just that: restore wetlands. Don't to study them, but let's put some restoration projects in the ground. So that was my entire career, first working as a state employee, and then for 27 years as a consultant, doing the same thing for the state, designing these projects, permitting, and then overseeing the construction of these. And so that's how this all started.
That's great, Tom. And can you tell us a little more about your role with the Ecosphere Restoration Institute?
Sure. About 22 years ago, while I was doing the work for the state, I noticed that one common denominator in all of them was they're all in public lands. It makes sense to use public dollars on public lands. It's cleaner, and that's great. But the problem is there are places that need to be restored or critical linkages that need to be addressed, and they don't happen to be on public land. And the birds and the fish don't recognize these boundaries. And as a restoration practitioner, we should not either. We should look at a landscape, see where there has been alterations, and if it needs to be done as a critical component, we should work on those even if it's on private land. So I started the nonprofit with that premise, public-private partnerships, or P3s as we call them. So we look for projects that are very critical. And if they're not on public lands, which since Florida, at least in this area, only owns 22% of the public land. So we could restore all of that and not really be moving the needle. By working on private lands and by opening up that scope, now we're putting on projects in the ground where they're the most needed. Now, you may ask, you're using public dollars on private lands. Is that fair? Well, it is if the private landowner is willing to put perpetual conservation easements. So 30 years from now, they don't just say, oh, let's take this out, put a living shoreline in. We don't like it. Well, they won't be able to do that because it's a conservation on the deed of the property. And so they can't get permits to do anything like that. And if the landowner is willing to do that and even help out with a little bit of the maintenance up front, then it's a win-win situation. Now we're getting these important projects put in where they should be, and they're perpetually preserved.
You have been involved in over 150 habitat restoration and stormwater retrofit projects, including some of the most ambitious and successful restoration projects in Florida. For our non-restoration experts, what do these kinds of projects consist of?
What we look for is altered lands. A lot of areas of Florida, they were farmed first. They were the first impacts to the land. The farmers are going to come in and they're going to do the best they can to get the productivity from that land. And that might mean draining the wetlands, right? And whatever it takes to get the most productivity. But eventually, especially one of the coastal areas, you start getting inundation with salt water or the crops aren't as productive. And eventually the farmer they just stop farming on that portion of the property. And eventually maybe even sell it. And that's how we'd work on public lands, because we would buy these old farm fields that were fallow for years. In Florida, we have a big issue with non-native vegetation coming in. So they get covered with non-native vegetation. So you have this blank slate. Now, the word restoration per Webster is restore in kind and in place. And we do that where we can. But a lot of parts of Florida used to be wetlands, and they're not being restored back or never will, because now there's a city sitting there essentially. So on that same water body, let's say Tampa Bay, where we have opportunities to take former uplands that are non-productive and restore them into freshwater wetlands, estuarine wetlands, uplands, put the whole mosaic in place, what used to be there. So that's what we look for. We look for altered lands. And that can be former farm fields, like I mentioned, or a lot of people were getting into the aquaculture business of growing tropical fish, because we have the climate. You can just dig a hole in your backyard and grow swordfish, for example, and then sell them to people that have aquariums. And they got so many of these put in that it saturated the market, and then people just left those holes in the ground. That's what we look for, is lands like that. And then we will find funding and then restore them.
I love that creative problem solving. I would like to hear more about your approach to preservation projects. What shifts have you seen in terms of funding for wetland preservation projects, and how has this informed your decision making at ERI?
Yeah, no, that's a real important thing, because it does inform our decision making. So depends what the political winds are. We've had governors here, even though voters voted 80% that they want lands to be preserved or purchased to be preserved, the governor just refused to do it. So there was no funding towards doing stuff like that. So we shift our paradigm a little bit and work again more on private lands. But right now, funds are being spent to purchase pristine properties. It's very expensive to restore property. It's better to protect functioning ecosystems. So that's one piece of it, is to buy pristine lands and protect them before they're gone. And then the other piece is buy disturbed lands and restore them. And so that affects how we go after funding. There's a lot of funding now, finally, in shoreline resiliency and living shorelines. And I've been doing living shorelines for a long time. I have 53 of them that we're involved with over 30 years. We didn't call them living shorelines. We just try to work with nature and restore and protect shorelines. But now that's a big coined term, living shorelines. And so there's a lot of funding for that. So we're helping cities and counties know that this funding is available. We'll write grants for them. And then we'll design, permit, and implement these living shorelines. So right now we're putting a lot of our emphasis on doing these living shorelines. We still do restoration projects. We still do spring restoration projects, but we chase the money. And right now it's a lot in this resiliency. And in Florida, when you have tidal surges or storms, you better have some resiliency on your shoreline and resiliency that'll protect your infrastructure.
You mentioned this before, but one aspect of your work that really stands out is your ability to bring public and private partners to the table to produce innovative and cost-saving designs for environmental projects. Why is this approach important for conserving wetlands? And are there any successful partnerships that come to mind?
I think it's important because we only have so much public lands. If we stick to only public lands and restore them, that's important and it's great, and I'm not discouraging that. I just think we need to start thinking bigger. Let's work on private lands because a lot of the land is privately owned. And so if we can restore those and put conservation easements, that's really important. So back in 2002, I was looking at aerial maps of this area here in Tampa Bay, Florida, and I saw that there was a creek. Well, in the 40s, they ran a dredge right up the middle, and now it's as straight as an arrow ditch. No ecosystem services. I'm like, oh man, this is the right salinity with most of the recreational important fish. They need those areas. Unfortunately, today, when they come sniffing around looking for that right salinity, it's just an outfall pipe. There's no place for them to hide, and they get consumed by their predators. So if we could go back and re-meander that creek, then we would have the right habitat within the right salinity. I contacted that landowner, happened to be a Tampa Electric company, which is a utility company in this region here. So I approached them and said, we'll get the funding if you're willing to put a conservation easement on it and manage the land. It becomes self-managing over time. But when you put living shorelines in, they're the weakest the day you put them in. And so you need to make sure these plants coalesce and live. And if they do, then you don't have to do maintenance anymore. So when they won Environmental Project of the Year in 2022, that turned corporate heads. And they said, what do you need? I'm like, well, we just restored this section. Would you be willing to purchase the next? We've done 7 phases of work with TECO, or Tampa Electric Company. And that's what I would call a successful relationship. They get the PR. They are doing something good. They're allowing us access. They have the conservation easement. They're doing the maintenance. And we are fixing a very critical habitat for fisheries here. And so we are always looking for partners like that because that expands our areas to improve wetlands.
And your ability to forge these successful relationships was a major factor in your selection for the National Wetlands Award in 2013 for conservation and restoration. 11 years later, how has this award impacted your career and what has it meant to you?
Well, that's a 2-part question. I'll start with what this means to me. I had no idea I was nominated. A local U.S. Fish and Wildlife rep, Nicole Adamy, took it on herself to put in an application. So when this award was announced, I was just blown away. And when I did some research on Environmental Law Institute and this whole award, man, I was impressed. The folks that had been awarded this category in the past were just giants in their field or in their geographic area. And I didn't feel that we were that big. But she put a very convincing application together, obviously, and we got that award. And so it meant a lot to me when I saw who else had won this and what they had accomplished. I think it helps us on our grant writing. All of our funding comes in through grants. And I just wanted to say also, we have no paid staff, right? It's all volunteers. My board's all volunteers. But when we get grants like this, then we'll hire whoever it takes to put that project in the ground. And so now those folks are getting paid by the grant. So having this award was powerful because it helped us get grants.
That's amazing, Tom. So glad to hear that. And as a last question, what do you think is the most pressing issue in wetlands conservation?
I think the most pressing is we need to protect as much pristine land, uplands, wetlands, the combo, as possible. Development is rampant, right? Especially in Florida. As long as we have the floodgates open and we're continuing to develop, we better at the same time be protecting as much land as possible. As I said before, it's very expensive to restore. And so it'd be better to protect what's good. Don't let us destroy everything and then try to come back and fix it. So I think the most pressing thing is to protect as much as you can. And at the same time, let's fix these altered lands, right? I think the third component to that is education. If we can't educate our young why it's important to protect the environment, then we're going to lose this environment. And this environment sustains us. So what can we do as everyday citizens? Think about your carbon footprint. It's not like we have to go live in a cave, right? We can still live in this lap of luxury in this affluent country we're in. We walk into any room with the flick of the switch, you can have lights on. And so when you walk out, shut them off. Or can you drop your AC 1 degree? If the entire country did that, we would see a difference. These aren't hard things to do. And then the next step, if you're really so inclined, get involved, volunteer, come out, plant, because then you own that project and you now feel, pride in keeping it there. We really can all make a difference. And so that's my advice is get involved, try and reduce your carbon footprint where you can. And that's all it takes. We don't have to really do something dramatic. On the corporate side, we do. But as far as citizens, just doing those steps, I think would be meaningful.
I totally agree, Tom, and thanks for providing a source of inspiration for the folks who are listening. It was great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.